A lavish lifestyle, infinite amounts of power, international fame, the ability to make your servants wipe your little booty till it's shiny, the finest things in life, aka the Crown of England. So it's no surprise people even as close as family would fight to the death over it. I'm talking about the War of the Roses, England's biggest civil war. But to understand the War of the Roses, you must understand succession. Succession is basically how governments determine who will take their leader's place, either after they abdicate, which means they choose to leave, or in most cases, they die. In England and most countries in medieval times, succession worked by when the king died, the crown would be passed down to the oldest son. Daughters would only be chosen if there were no male children. This is medieval times, they were pretty sexist. So this brings us to the year 1377, in England. King Edward III had just died. He had 4 sons, the oldest being Edward the Black Prince. So the crown would go to Edward. Well, there was one problem. You see, Edward a year earlier had died, so the crown would go to the second youngest brother who is still alive, wouldn't it? Well, no, because England's law of succession states that the crown still goes to dead people, then it acts as if the person had just died, so the crown would go to the dead person's heirs, if they had any. Edward did. He had a son, Richard II, who was only 10 years old. This made the sons of the first king, Edward III, angry. Number 1, the crown had completely skipped over all of them. And number 2, they're 10 times as fit to be king than this little 10-year-old. 2 of the brothers who were especially mad were John, the Duke of Lancaster, and Edmund, Duke of York, which became the Lancasters and the Yorks, the 2 families that would fight for the crown of England. So John's son, Henry IV, in 1399 took control of the crown of England from Richard II. Richard was then thrown into the Tower of London, where he died. Not much happened until Henry IV died in 1413, so the crown passed on to his oldest son, Henry V, who had a short reign since he died in battle in 1422. Fun fact, he didn't even die of a sword or arrow wound. No, he died of dysentery. That's like the absolute worst way for a king to die. Anyway, Henry died at the age of 36. He was only able to produce one son, Henry VI. He was still a baby. Also, why were there so many Henrys? I mean, no offense to any Henrys, but this is the 6th Henry. I mean, the British royal family is just purposely being confusing. Either way, since he was so young when he became king, he grew up being told what to say and think by his advisors and regents. These were people who took care of a king if they were too young to rule. They even decided that he would marry Prince Margaret of Anjou to get the French people to like England more. Margaret, unlike her husband, was decisive and was very controlling of him. But someone she couldn't control was Richard of York, who was the general and trusted advisor for Henry. Richard hated Margaret, mainly for the way she was corrupt, misusing military resources and giving privileges to her friends, causing England to perform poorly in their wars with France. Margaret didn't want people in the court to start thinking she was corrupt, or Henry wasn't capable of winning the war with France. So she had him sent to Ireland, where Richard put on a kilt and drank Guinness beer and potatoes for the rest of his life. Or so she thought. While Richard was in Ireland, he raised an army and returned to the capital to arrest Margaret's corrupt friends and reform the government. He failed, but King Henry had a mental breakdown. He went insane, and England needed someone to run the country. So Richard was appointed as Protector of the Realm, which meant he would act as a regent, taking command of England while the king was having his mental breakdown. Richard then reformed the English government, even arresting Margaret's corrupt friends. But soon King Henry recovered, so Richard was no longer Protector of the Realm. Margaret, disliking the new reforms, got Henry to undo all Richard's laws. England was back to its good old dysfunctioning corrupt self. So Richard ran off and raised a brand new army. He failed in taking over the throne, but he got reinstated as Protector of the Realm, and made it so his children would succeed to become king. This really made Margaret angry because her sons were meant to be king. There were people who also shared this view with Margaret, causing many revolts to happen around England. One of these was in a place called Wakefield, where Richard of York was killed in battle. Richard had 2 sons, the oldest being Edward IV, who decided to avenge his father and try and take the crown of England for himself. He raised an army and was able to overthrow King Henry and capture him, while his wife, Margaret, and her son Edward, who she still thought should be king, left the country. Now, in those days, marrying someone was like marrying their entire family. Normally you would become instant friends and would be militarily allied. So it was very important who you married, and love never really played a big part in your choice. The new king, Richard IV, was meant to marry a powerful French princess. but he made the mistake of marrying a lowly widow. This caused the princess's family to instead ally themselves with the other family, the Lancasters. The princess's family, like the Earl of Warwick, helped the Lancasters take back the English crown, making Henry king again. And all was good, at least for a little bit, because Edward had raised an army. He came across the Earl of Warwick, who was commanding an army and accompanying Margaret and her son Edward of Westminster, at a place called Tewkesbury. Edward IV and his army attacked and killed Earl Warwick. Without Earl Warwick, the army was hopeless. Margaret and Edward of Westminster desperately tried to command their forces, but Edward was killed in battle and Margaret was taken prisoner. Edward then took the crown of England and this time locked King Henry in the Tower of London, and Henry eventually died. Under mysterious circumstances. Woo, spooky. Well, actually, he was probably just ordered to be killed by King Edward, but whatever. Edward IV lived a pretty peaceful and uneventful life after that. He had 2 sons who were going to succeed him when he died. It all seemed like smooth sailing from there. The crown of England was supposedly secure for his family. Well, that was until Edward died. Instead of the crown going to his oldest son, Edward's brother, Richard III, wanted to be king. So he said that Edward's sons were illegitimate, meaning they weren't royalty and couldn't become king, because their mother was a widower. So Richard took the crown of England and threw the boys in prison, so they wouldn't be able to challenge his legitimacy. 2 years passed and Richard wasn't a great king. Not many people liked him, so when in France, a man named Henry Tudor, who was a direct descendant of John Lancaster, who originally tried to have his family on the throne of England when Edward III died, decided he would try and become king, he got a lot of support. He raised an army in France and came to England by boat. In the year 1485, he destroyed Richard like a tank destroys a Ducati. He was now king and needed to make alliances, so he married Edward the king before Richard's daughter, Elizabeth, allying the 2 families together, joining the 2 roses, thus ending centuries of civil war. History shows us that any medieval war can be solved when a man and a woman have ooks. So the lesson is, make love, not war. You might be thinking that the War of the Roses were a unique kind of war, that countries don't really fight themselves. I mean, that would be counterproductive. Well, you'd be wrong. Civil wars happen all the time and still do. They're one of the most common types of war. Whether it's a business fighting over who should be CEO, or like in Japan, where several royal families would fight to be emperor. Civil wars are a common type of war anywhere. Anywho, that's the end of the War of the Roses, and this is the end of this video.